Hello and welcome to this rather unusual Legion focus. So this video primarily concerns itself with the workflow of projects. The colour recipe for the Ultramarine tutorial will run alongside this, but I want to concentrate on how to create armies. So this technique, this style of painting I've used throughout my commission work career so far. I found this a very highly effective way for creating bulk troops very quickly to a very high standard. So to begin the process, I undercoat everything with black, and then I use a white on top of that to sketch out my shadows and highlights. Not only does this establish my rough highlights, it also allows me to see the miniature a little bit more clearly. So when I do start developing the tones on top of this, any mistakes in the formulation I can correct at this point. Next up we have the mid-tone. So this is our middle colour, which we'll start to modulate in later layers. I tend to build up all my colour schemes this way now because it gives me a clear idea of where the miniature is headed. By adding the mid-tone, I could decide whether I want to modulate it at this stage, darkening it, lightening it later on. For this technique I've used blue and blue ink from Vallejo Air and Scale 75 respectively. I'll give 2 to 3 complete layers over the top, and this will cover all the black and all the white. The Ultramarine recipe is slightly divergent in how I normally approach projects. If you refer to the Blood Angel tutorial, you can see I use a orange and then I build up to a sunny skin tone. But with this, I think of this technique kind of like double frying a chip or a fry for anyone else in the world. When you double fry it, it concentrates the texture of it, and that's what we're doing here. We're trying to produce a really deep azure, really strong colour. In order to do this, I'm reapplying my white zenithal highlight in a slightly more concentrated burst. I want to ensure that those highlights really pop out at you, and it's a very highly eye-bleedingly visual impact on the viewer. Next up, I use Caspian Blue from Scale 75, and I will thin this down to almost a glaze-like consistency. It's slightly thicker than a glaze, and I'll airbrush this on top of the highlights through to the upper mid-tone and the mid-tone itself. Later on in the process, I can modulate this slightly more with thinned down blue ink, but I need a good coverage of turquoise for one part to really make it stand out, really make it visually impactful, and secondly to give me some structure to the highlights I'll start to build up later on. So next up we are using blue ink, just pure blue ink, and we are thinning this right the way down to a beyond a glaze consistency. And we reapply this over the shadow, the lower mid-tone, the mid-tone, and the upper mid-tone. Now when we apply it in this way, we need to ensure that we apply one layer across the entirety of the armour, and then another layer from the upper mid-tone downward, a third layer from the mid-tone downward, and so forth. So we're leaving the highlights with only one coat of this colour rather than 2 to 3 which the shadows will receive. Next up, we need to paint in all our metallic details. Just one flat metallic coat. In this case I'm using Dwarven Gold by Scale 75, and I will use Magnesium by Vallejo. After this I will be using Vallejo Gloss Varnish across the entirety of the surface of the miniature and apply any decals where necessary. So I won't be showing that in this lesson, this episode, how to apply decals. It's in other videos, and there will be a standalone video on this subject. Essentially, Microsol and Microset are your friends. After the varnish has dried, I will apply my oils. In this case, Lamp Black and Burnt Umber. For the pin wash stage, it's Lamp Black, so it's a concentrated black colour, which we will go into more detail on this miniature that you can see in front of us. This will be coming this month, if not so already. I don't know when they'll exactly be scheduled out yet. as of time of recording. As you can see, the pin wash just levels the gloss varnish, breaks the surface tension of the miniature, and it makes the paint more predictable in where it flows. So when we touch our brush to the surface, it will run into all the gaps and recesses, reaffirming the sculpt itself. For the metallics, I use a much thicker concentration, which I use to stain the underlying layers. This is predominantly burnt umber with a tiny amount of black. You may not choose to use any black whatsoever. I find that this gives a kind of dirty, grubby look to the gold. Now we need to allow this to dry for at least 12 hours, and then we can come with a clean cotton bud and remove any excess. Unlike pin washing, it will stain the underlying layer, which is what we are looking for because we want to highlight at a later stage. Essentially, we are washing all the gold and silver. Once the oils have dried, we need to apply another layer of gloss varnish and then matte varnish across the entire surface to make sure that the decals are coherent with the rest of the miniature. Sometimes you could get a silvery outline if you don't apply them properly. By adding a secondary layer of gloss varnish on top helps it blend into the scene. Now we've given ourselves a massive advantage here using normal acrylic paints through the airbrush, in that we can just match them up very, very easily here. So I've sped up the video slightly to show you where I place my most predominant highlights. Top of the head, top of the chest, top of the legs and arms. We want to pick out the most prominent details that reflect the most amount of light. The head is an excellent place to concentrate on. If nothing else, faces and bases will make for an excellent army. For this I'm using Caspian Blue as my first edge highlight, and then I'm increasing the amount of ivory loaded up on the tip of the brush for a further highlight. There will be pictures up on the Facebook page of these completed miniatures, so you can see where I place my light reflections. It's also at this stage I can correct any mistakes that I've made up until this point. So oil paints are phenomenal for blacklining miniature, but they dull everything down so significantly. So you need to reapply, or you need to do this layer after the oil stages to bring the lightness of tone up and give contrast. For the golds, I'm using Dwarven Gold, and a pretty similar technique to previously with the armour. I am increasing the amount of silver on there to edge highlight it and give it a really luminous spark, a really luminous edge to it. For the gun barrel and for the chainsword, I want you to black in, just paint them black, no need to do anything more than that. And then we are taking a sponge with a light silver colour, in this case silver from the Vallejo Model Air range. I'm just dotting this along the barrel of the gun as well as the casing as well. So this is a secondary effect of chipping and making it look highlighted. So it's a really nice 2-for-1 for your infantry marines. And then I've applied some further chipping onto the jetpack, and I think I've made a mistake there, so I'm just quickly rubbing it off. For the eyes, I blacken them in, and then I use Marrow White from Formula P3. I'll be adding deep red across the entirety of the surface, and then I will be highlighting with a touch of Sunny Skin Tone mixed with Antares Red by Scale 75. You can see what I'm doing here with the white. So the white after the weathering didn't look as bright as the airbrush layers. So I'm just going in with a brush, I'm dotting it. You can see how I use the brush to give it an artificial texture. It highlights it and makes it look like it's slightly weathered as well, all for one. All in one stage. Back to the eye. Sorry, got a bit sidetracked then. So deep red, then we highlight it with Antares red. In here I'm adding black into the very, very top. This will be covered in the PDF tutorial as well. A step-by-step guide for it, so don't worry if my garbled explanations get in the way. Again, this is more about workflow rather than the colour recipe employed. And any ancillary details come in here. So I've mixed up some ivory and black that I have on my palette from previous painting session. I'm highlighting the rubber banding that separates the armour plate. And again, any mistakes that I've made up until this point I can correct here with a few tasteful weathering marks. For the eye, I'm just giving the smile 2 dots up in the top corner, and then a big beaming toothy smile. A word on edge highlighting. So it can be seen as a bit of a dirty word in our hobby, especially heresy, but I want you to pay attention to how I manipulate the brush on the surface of a miniature. It isn't simply a case of just creating smooth, wiped lines across the edges. No, I use it almost like a stippling in the stippling technique to create artificial texture and the story behind the miniature. All the armour plates will receive some kind of scrapes and scratches, and that's what this technique aims to replicate with your brushstroke. And here we have it. This is the unit in all its entirety. Beautiful blue bastards that they are. The basing tutorial will be a part of a separate, I think it may be released already or maybe coming up very, very soon this month. If you use any of these techniques on your own work, please feel free to send them through to me. I love to see what cool things you guys create. Thank you very much for watching, and if you do use this tutorial and you post online, please link it to the Patreon. It helps so much. Thank you once again, and I will catch you next time.